I will fight with honor.
Welcome to Interactive Draft Paladin, where you get to make the picks and see whether or not your picks line up with mine. Paladin is one of the classes which has the most value because when you push this button, you actually guaranteed develop the board, which is unique to all the classes. Paladin tends to be one of the best classes in top decking mode because Reinforce tends to be the best board affecting ability other than the Warlock life tap if you have a lot of life. Oftentimes I'll make plays trying to incorporate the Reinforce into the play because each turn you can only use a hero ability once, and using this means you develop a guy on the board. It's pretty nice. It'll give you some time to make each pick. Just click on the pick if you want to make the timer go faster. Feel free to pause the video to think about your pick a bit longer, and we'll tally up your score at the end. Alright, Divine Favor tends to be too inconsistent in Arena, so I don't value that card very highly. Crazed Alchemist is okay. Lily Wrath is also a bit unexciting, but it is, on average, better than Hammer of Wrath, though it is quite inconsistent. It's very tricky to play that card. I'd say this is one of those cards which, though has a lot to do with RNG, is not as bad as it looks necessarily, and sometimes is really good, and you can usually plan for contingencies, and at the worst it's draw a card. Meh. Oh my gosh. Okay, we got some pretty good legendaries here. All three of these are above average. I used to think when I first started that Deathwing was unplayable, but my opinion on Deathwing has gone up quite a bit in Arena, where it's slow enough that you can usually survive to cast Deathwing if you draft a curve that's reasonable. And usually you can get in a situation where you and your opponent exhaust everything and then you play the Deathwing and then you win. That happens a good enough amount of times, I should say. That Deathwing is actually a good pick. Illidan Stormrage is also a good pick because you can play it as a 6-mana 7/5 and it's unexciting, but the upside is pretty big. Like in the late game you can play it and then play a couple more cards, and if it sticks around you get so much value out of it. So that's a good card too. But Onyxia is really the ultimate card, one of the best legendaries you can get, since so often you're going to be constantly trading for board control. In Onyxia you just get 9 mana 14/14 of value. It's one of the top legendaries. Ancient Mage doesn't do enough, stats are bad. Questing Adventurer is generally poor, even though it's very enticing, because there are a lot of games where people have played against Questing Adventurer and then they know it's a priority kill, but the turn it comes out it's usually weak, and if you save it for the late game, and it's usually like at best a 3-mana 4/4 if you combo it with like other cards in the late game. Eldar Peacekeeper is one of those cards that's always one of the best cards, so of course Eldar Peacekeeper here. 3-mana 3/3 is good enough, and you get that ability. Stormwind Knight is an okay card. Sen'jin Shieldmaster is a very good card, but even better than that is the Argent Protector. One thing worth mentioning is that this thing, even though it says 2 mana, is not really a 2-mana card. It's usually more like a 3-mana card, since you play a 2-drop and then you play the Protector, and then hopefully you give it Divine Shield and then you trade and you're really far ahead. Or if you're going second, you play a coin 2-drop and then you play the Argent Protector and you trade against their 2-drop, but your guy survives, which is the ultimate value for the Argent Protector. So definitely Argent Protector here. Easy pick here. Scarlet Crusader is a very efficient 3-mana card. Usually will trade for either your opponent's 4 mana because they lose their 2-drop and then they use a hero ability to finish it, or it kills 2 things in the case that the opponent doesn't have a 1 damage hero ability. Very strong. These two are no good. This pick is going to be a bit close. You've got Acidic Swamp Ooze, which is a 2-mana 3/2, one of the best 2-mana 3/2s for the common slot. Actually, it is currently the best 2-mana 3/2 for neutral. Destroying your opponent's weapon is a big deal. Raid Leader, even though you're a Paladin, you have many recruits to lead, is still very poor. It's one of those cards which is only good when you're slightly ahead or even-ish, and the stats are very bad, so it's quite bad when you're behind. Harvest Golem is a really solid 3-mana card. At every single stage of the game, you should consider your mana curve, and right now there are 2 3-mana cards and 0 2-mana cards, but it is early on, so I'm still inclined to just pick the strongest card, which is going to be the Harvest Golem here. But there is some validity to picking the Acidic Swamp Ooze, given that there are no 2-drops. I'm going to say this one's too close to call, but Harvest Golem is my inclination for... Basically, it's how lucky do you feel on being able to gather up your about 7-ish 2-drops. Today I feel lucky. Maybe on another day I'd have picked the Ooze, because I wouldn't have felt lucky. I don't know. It's really too close to call. These cards are all slightly below average. Abusive Sergeant gets the most value here because you often get a minion target to do as a Paladin as you get more recruits. Elven Archer, slightly better in a class that can deal 1 damage. Paladin is like almost being able to deal 1 damage with their hero ability. Cobalt Geomancer, 2-mana 2/2, just not good enough stats. I usually don't like 1-mana 2/1s, but this one happens to have a very good battle cry. We've got the set of Paladin 1 cards here. Blessing of Might is reasonable. It's 1-mana, deal 3 damage if you have board presence. Sometimes slightly better than 1-mana, deal 3 damage because you use it and then hit the opponent's face, or you hit the opponent's minion and your guy survives, but those cases are rare. Paladins tend to be all about board control, so you're usually using this to deal 3 damage to a minion when you buff your minion and trade it into their minion. Blessing of Wisdom is a solid card. At worst, it draws 1 card for 1 mana. At best, it draws a lot of cards, and I usually try to cast it in a position where I can get 2 cards off of it. In that case, like 1 mana draw 2 is awfully good, and in the worst case, it's usually at worst 1 mana draw 1. There are some times where you can never play it, but even if you have nothing and they have stuff, you can cast it on their minions and possibly dissuade them from attacking, or maybe they make a mistake and attack while they have the Blessing of Wisdom. Noble Sacrifice, I find, tends not to do enough to justify it. 1 mana 2/1 with kind of taunt. Slightly better than 1 mana 2/1 with taunt, but tends not to do enough as a card. Loot Hoarder is an excellent 2-mana minion. In the worst case, in the late game, you can use it to cycle and draw another card. In the best case, in the early game, you play it against their 3/2, and then you trade the 2/1 into their 3/2, and then you also draw a card. Medium case, you play it, and then they use a hero ability to kill it, in which case you're even. Reckless Rocketeer costs too much for what it does. Oasis Snapjaw is an okay card, but it's not as good as the 2-drops we need, and Paladins tend to have a lot of 4-drops, so 4-drops in general tend to be slightly worse than Paladin when they're not of the top quality cards. We've got some losers here, and I'm actually thinking about whether or not it's worth it to take the Secret Keeper, which is a 1-mana 1/2, which is quite bad, but has upside when you play secrets, and it is possible this deck will play secrets. At the same time, I'm also slightly thinking about the Holy Wrath, and whether or not I want to pick another 1-cost card. But it is possible that I will get the only secret I like in Paladin, Avenge, and then the Secret Keeper will be buffed. Cold Light Seer is the best card in this pack for the stats. 3-mana 2/3 is of course quite bad, but you know, when you're comparing with Secret Keeper and Angry Chicken, you can't really complain. Angry Chicken is terrible. 1-mana 1/1. I'm gonna pick Secret Keeper. Hopefully I get Avenge or something. Easy pick here. The Cobalt Geomancer has poor stats, so Flesh Eating Ghoul is better in an aggressive deck. This one is currently not looking that aggressive, and also I kind of dislike its inconsistency anyways. In the worst case, it's a 3 mana 2/3. In an even case, it's a 3 mana 4/3, which is pretty good. It's reasonable. When you're far ahead, the Flesh-Eating Ghoul wins games, but you probably would have won anyways. Sometimes the Flesh-Eating Ghoul gets out of control. It's slightly better in Paladin because you have a lot of guys to feed the Flesh-Eating Ghoul. But the Dark Iron Dwarf is just so much better that it's the obvious pick. Top 4 mana card. I currently have no 4s. This card's ridiculously good. It's even better than Paladin because you have more minions to target. Okay, so we're 10 picks in. I'm rolling over my arena deck here and seeing that I've got 2 Death Rattle cards. So the pro of Redemption is that there are a few cards in this deck which are good to redeem. That would be the Loot Hoarder, and the Harvest Golem, and the Scarlet Crusader. Scarlet Crusader comes back with Divine Shield, the Death Rattle guys get to have Death Rattle again. And it's a secret for the Secret Keeper. Blessing of Wisdom is, I'd say, like, if this were the first pick, I would take it. It's like the strongest on average card. I already have a Blessing of Wisdom. Undertaker has the potential to be really good. I've gotten 2 cards so far. Paladins don't have any natural class cards other than Tyrion, which triggers the Undertaker. The Redemption has the pro that the Secret Keeper gets activated off of it also. Oh, this one is close. I mean, they're cards that all 3 of them are cards I don't want to pick, but here's something really important. Each card you pick does matter quite a bit in your deck. When I agonize over one pick, it really does matter, because more often than not, I'd say you tend to see the card you pick in each game. Because on average, I would say you draw over half your deck, 15 cards. In this case, I'm going to pick the card that is most independently strong. Although I can understand reasons behind the other 2 picks also. Am I going to do that? Yeah, I'm going to pick Blessing of Wisdom. I think it's a very close call. I think you could justify any of them. Alright, here we've got Frostwolf Warlord, which tends to be better than a Paladin deck because you can always get a guy and then get a 5/5 on turn 7 at least. Blessing of Wisdom, which I definitely don't want more of. Lord of the Arena, which is less good than the Warlord in general. 6 mana, 6/5 in stats isn't very good. Every single one mana card I take, I wince a little because of Holy Wrath. It's not a reason to not take it if it were the best card. I mean, it's a slight reason against it. Dread Corsair, I have no weapons yet, but it is possible I pick up True Silver Champion, and then I get a Dread Corsair. Or I can take the more consistent Grizzly. Given no True Silver yet, I'm going to take the Grizzly. It is better than Hand of Protection. Not exceptional, but it's a card. Redemption, I don't think earlier I talked enough about this card, so the problem with Redemption is your opponent generally can control which one gets recovered, so sometimes your 1/1 guy just gets killed and then you get another 1/1, and that's really boring, and it happens more often than not. It's very tricky to position Redemption in a way that works well for you, so I tend to think of it as quite a weak card. Ascension Shieldmaster is a good 4, and I'm glad for it because somehow in this Paladin deck I still haven't drawn any of the trademark good 4 cards for Paladin: Consecration, True Silver Champion, Hammer of Wrath, Blessing of Kings, but I have no doubt that they will come in time. Ascension Shieldmaster, clearly the pick. Holy Light, life gain tends to be bad because arena decks tend to be board control games, and decks are rarely aggressive enough for Holy Light to actually make a difference. Usually it just doesn't do enough as a card. Alright, we have one of the best cards for Paladin in here. Hooray! It's not the South Sea Deckhand, which is a 1 mana 2/1 and is not good enough. True Silver Champion is where it's at. An excellent weapon 2-for-1s against medium minions. That's really good, and gives yourself a bit of health to boot. Direwolf Alpha, slightly better in a Paladin deck, but nowhere near the level of True Silver Champion. Light's Justice, which is, in my experience, not as bad as people think it is, but still, that isn't saying much because people think it is terrible, but it has some value at least, but still generally not enough to justify a card. Wisp is not enough to justify a card even though it's free. It does cost a card to play it, so that's where infinite value would be false. Oasis Snapjaw is an average 4-mana card, which means in Paladin it tends to be bad, but it's still the best pick here. I've got an Abusive Sergeant, which is a little bit on the weak side. Fen Creeper, I don't like it, even though it's a big taunt. It just doesn't have enough stats. I tend to pick cards like Spiteful Smith. Oh, I actually got the name right for once. Not Spectral Smith, Spiteful Smith. Just because it is a 4/6, one more stat. I'm going to pick the Guardian of Kings over both, as I think I need more late game. Guardian of Kings is one of those cards which is also not very exciting. I think it would be a perfectly reasonable card if it were like 6 mana. That would be reasonable. But hey, I'll take it anyways. We got a War Golem, which is a big dumb card. Slightly below average card because the other card here, Stormwind Champion, tends to be better. Light's Justice doesn't do enough. Stranglethorn Tiger, that's a good card. 5 mana, 5/5, you get to dictate how it attacks. It's a fine card. This deck currently has no aggression to it, so Arcane Golem is a ridiculous choice. Cold Light Seer has very poor stats. Sunwalker, easy choice. Good card. Covers the 6 slot, which I have none of, and is a high quality card. I'm going to have to take a moment to look at my early game, which is currently a Secret Keeper, not counting the Abusive Sergeant, Secret Keeper, Loot Hoarder, not counting the Argent Protector. So currently in the early game I only have 2 cards. That makes the Shadowed Sun Cleric substantially worse, because it is less likely to be able to buff something. That said, let's go through the cards. There's Archmage, which is a big card, 4/7. Not as good as Ogre, but sometimes you don't get Ogre and you pick Archmage. It is better than the Lord of the Arena, which is a 6 mana, 6/5, 5 health, not enough for 6. And then the Shadowed Sun Cleric, which tends to be good and is a lot better if you have early game. It's better in a Paladin deck because you can always get a guy and then put the Shadowed Sun Cleric on it. It's on the poorer side in this deck because of the lack of early game, but I'm still going to pick it. I think it's better on average than these cards. Another way to think of it is on 5 mana, I can play the Shadowed Sun Cleric and a guy at worst, and that creates 9 stats worth of stuff, a 3/2 and a 2/2. That's not too bad. It's not too terrible. Gnomish Inventor, which is always a solid card. I'd pick it fairly highly. Eye for an Eye, which is one of the worst cards in the game. Your opponent can completely dictate how much damage it does. It's just damage to the face for a card that is really not worth it. And Cult Master, which is one of the cards I love picking up the most in Paladin. You can draw a lot of cards with it. We've got in this deck the Dream of Onyxia into Cult Master. I mean, I pick Cult Master very highly in Paladin. Oh, thank goodness, we have a 2-drop. Alright, so Holy Wrath, which is terrible in this deck, given the 4 1-drops in the deck. Knife Juggler, which is one of the best 2-drops in the Paladin deck. You get it, it's a 2 mana 3/2. You can get Recruits with it, and then you get the Knife value. It's good. Divine Favor is generally going to be poor in this deck. Thank goodness, more 2-drops. This is exactly what we need. Youthful Brewmaster is looking to be quite good in this deck. There's Argent Protector, Aldor Peacekeeper, Shattered Sun Cleric, Dark Iron Dwarf, Guardian of Kings, Onyxia as targets to return, and it's a 2-mana 3/2. It'll more often be played as a 2-mana 3/2 than returning, but that is a nice bonus if it gets to late game. Unstable Ghoul is a okay card. Slightly worse than Paladin because you're usually friendly firing your minions, but I would still pick that card fairly highly in this deck just due to the necessity to control the board in the 2-drop area. Bluegill Warrior, I would even take that card against most cards just because we need 2s so badly, but Youthful Brewmaster is the best 2 here. Oh my gosh, this mana curve was looking so bad, but now we've got more 2s coming in. Abusive Sergeant again, that's not terrible, but Loot Hoarder is a really good 2-drop, and I sorely still need more 2-drops. Good thing I just picked 2 in a row, and now the third one. Mogishan Warden is a mediocre, it's not just mediocre, it's a bad 4-drop, doesn't have enough stats to justify the position. Worgen Infiltrator is a good early game card. You get to dictate the 2 damage how you want. Again, in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, oh, this card makes Holy Wrath worse, but I mean, the other cards would all only be a 1 damage increase. If I pick the Nubar Weblord, which it's not as good as the Worgen Infiltrator, I should say. A 2-mana 1/4 might be something that is acceptable in this deck. Blessing of might whiff due to the lack of early minions, so... And it's also just not as good as Worgen Infiltrator. Worgen Infiltrator does 2 by itself. Blessing of Might needs to be in combination with something else to do 3. And usually you have to have that card out already. Because if you just Blessing of Might like a recruit, then it just gets fire blasted or something. Easy pick here, but it's not for any good reason. So you've got the Noble Sacrifice, which doesn't really do enough, and there's a slight consideration for picking it because of Secret Keeper, but that is not enough consideration. The Ogre Magi is a below average 4-mana card, but it is better than the Stoneskin Gargoyle, which is a far, far below average 3-mana card. The stats are so poor on this card that it is nearly laughable. So I picked the 4-mana 4/4, unexciting. Okay, so we've got a terrible choice here. There's major cons to all of them. Holy Wrath is really bad in this deck given the 5 1-drops. Arcane Golem is bad in this deck because it's 3 mana, deal 4 damage, and you give your opponent Mana Crystal. Divine Favor is bad in this deck because it's slow enough that you might not draw any cards. So I pick Holy Wrath. I mean, on average, it looks like it's gonna deal 4 damage. I mean, I should say the median is 4 damage. Since this deck is skewed left, the actual average is closer to 3 damage. And there's some real disasters that could happen. But I'm gonna pick Holy Wrath because it's the best card here. Alright, Dalaran Mage has really bad stats, Stone Tusk Boar has really bad stats, Frost Elemental is at least reasonable, and I do need more late game. And, oh man, did we get a good... Wow, those 3 cards... if I could replace like 2 of the weaker cards in this deck and pick all 3, that would make this deck a lot better. Anyways, Avenging Wrath is really good, 6 mana, deal 8 damage, which can hit minions, is really strong. Sword of Justice is one of those cards which you play and sometimes you just outright win the game because it's basically a 3 mana 5/5, and that's really strong and it's really flexible. Lay on Hands is good in this deck because it could use more fuel in the late game. I'm going to pick Sword of Justice because it's one of the best epics in the game. And it looks good in this deck. It looks good in any deck, really. Okay, so that is the Paladin deck. In this particular interactive draft, you were faced with a series of many bad choices, but sometimes you just have to grit your teeth and pick the best choice available. I'd say this deck is below average in power for sure, even though it has a cool endgame Onyxia, and even though it's got a really strong Sword of Justice. It's not really enough to justify, like, in Arena, every single bad pick you make will haunt you because it does come up more often than not. So we've got quite a few below average picks here. Secret Keeper, I'm going to kind of count Abusive Sergeant in there, kind of. Okay, let's count slightly below average cards also. Abusive Sergeant, Snapjaw Turtle, Oasis Snapjaw, Ogre Magi, kind of Iron for Grizzly, you can put that in there. The 2 Holy Wraths. So there's a number, and like even Guardian of Kings is a card I'm not too excited on, but it's a 1 late game. It's actually fairly reasonable in this deck. The curve was really bad, but it got rescued near the end as I picked up 3 2-drops. So right now in the early game, there's Secret Keeper, Infiltrator, Protector, kind of, Juggler, 2 Loot Hoarders, a Youthful Brewmaster. There's also always the Paladin hero ability, which is one of the better ones to press on turn 2 if you have to press a hero ability. Like, if you were to just judge this mana curve, it actually looks fairly good. Like, if I didn't look at the deck and I looked at the mana curve, and I was like, if I was told, you picked some really good 1-drops like Zombie Chow, then I'd be like, wow, what a great deck. I want this mana curve always. So it's got that going for it. It didn't pick up a few of the star cards like Consecration. It only has 1 True Silver Champion. There's no Blessing of Kings, no Hammer of Wrath. Instead of Hammer of Wrath, we've got the 2 inconsistent Holy Wraths, which might be good enough, but maybe not. But hey, it looked, when I went into saying this was below average, I thought it would be worse than it is, but like it got bailed out a bit near the end. So I'm going to guess that this deck will go 6 wins, but with a significant chance that it actually makes it even further. It has no comeback mechanisms. Well, I guess it has Onyxia. I mean, it has no early game comeback mechanisms, so I gotta stay out ahead early. But that's doable.